Well, welcome back, students, and now let's get ready for the thrilling conclusion of the Great War. Now, when we last left our heroes, Europe was stuck in the meat grinder of a world war, hiding in trenches and slaughtering each other by the million. By 1917, the situation was so desperate that Russia had not one but two different revolutions, the second one being a communist revolution that would eventually create the USSR, our chief rival in the Cold War. But it would also take Russia out of the war. More on that later. But it did mean that the Germans would be able to focus all of their attention on the Western Front, where our besties, the British, were holding out, desperate for the US to join the war. Now, when the war did break out, the United States was perfectly happy not to get involved. Sure, it had that special relationship with Great Britain, but Serbia, the Archduke, Germany's blank check, we could label those things someone else's problem. Indeed, we remained neutral because we're always neutral. It's what we do. It's what we've done since the days of President Washington. You want to invade another country? Have fun storming the castle, but leave us out of it. But not exactly, because weapons makers in the United States saw the Great War for what it was, a money-making opportunity. So even though we were neutral, we weren't totally out of the picture. And it meant that weapons would be transported across the Atlantic and into the war zone, which brings us to the issue of submarine warfare. Now, normally, citizen or civilian ships, those ones who are not involved in the war, those are supposed to be off limits. Even during war, civilian ships are off limits. This is why it's called restricted warfare, and when it applies to submarine warfare, it's called restricted submarine warfare, or RSW. But to cut off all the supplies to Britain and her allies, the Germans practiced unrestricted submarine warfare, or USW, which meant that every ship, civilian or not, was fair game. And so in 1915, the passenger ship Lusitania was struck by a German U-boat, killing nearly 1,200 civilians, and among them 128 Americans. The US was rightfully incensed, but the German government said, look, we warned you, and they had. In the newspaper a week earlier, they had taken out an advertisement which said, passengers are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and Great Britain, and travelers sailing into the war zone on ships of Great Britain do so at their own risk. Which is fair, but it did not make Americans any happier about the fact that their civilians had been killed in the Lusitania. After a few more ships were attacked, the United States threatened to join the war, if only to protect the freedom of the seas, which of course meant its freedom to sell weapons to anyone it wanted to. And so this was the reason that Germany gave the Sussex Pledge. And the Sussex Pledge promised only to pursue RSW, restricted submarine warfare, for the remainder of the war. Problem solved. Only the problem wasn't solved, because the longer the war went on, the worse things got for the Germans. Britain was able to supply itself from pretty much anywhere in the world, just hiding their armaments on passenger ships, while Germany was increasingly running out of supplies and men. The longer the war went on, the more Germany needed to do something to break the logjam and win the war. And so for the sports fans out there, Germany threw a Hail Mary called the Zimmermann Telegram. Now, the telegram was a secret cable to the Mexican government. And here's what it said. You can read along if you'd like. It starts off fairly mundane, 130130042. But then, pretty quickly, it makes a really dangerous turn. In line 5, it says 222-84222-001945. And it gets worse. 3 lines later, with 6789358705454? Oh, snap. Oh, no, you did not. Oh, yes, I did. Now, for those of you who don't happen to speak secret code, I'll translate for you. We intend to begin unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavor, in spite of this, to keep the United States neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance. Make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Yikes. So Germany went back on the Sussex Pledge. Okay, and they went back to unrestricted submarine warfare. But worse than that, they tried to keep the United States occupied with Mexico, which is not such a far-fetched idea when you consider that the United States, at that very moment, had troops in northern Mexico trying and failing to find Pancho Villa. So remember that the United States was neutral, and it liked it that way. And so when war broke out in Europe, Americans might have been concerned, but never really enough to get involved. In fact, one of the most popular songs of 1915 was a catchy little tune called "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier," with lyrics like this: 10 million soldiers to the war have gone who may never return. 10 million mothers' hearts must break for the ones who have died in vain. Head bowed down in sorrow in her lonely years, I heard a mother murmur through her tears, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier, I brought him up to be my pride and joy. Who dares to put a musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's darling boy? Who dares to put a musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's darling boy? Subtle it is not, but then almost suddenly, after the public heard about the Zimmerman telegram and the resumption of USW, which had already killed hundreds of American civilians, the country suddenly caught war fever. And it was particularly tricky for Woodrow Wilson, who had just a few months earlier campaigned for re-election with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And now he was leading the country right into war. But Wilson, being Wilson, he couldn't just make the declaring war a policy decision. He needed the war to mean something more, something clear, something definitive, like a battle between good and evil, between God himself and Satan incarnate. No wonder he cast the war as a war to make the world safe for democracy, and even more, this war couldn't just be another skirmish in the struggles between man and it needed to be a war to end all war. And that means to usher in the 1,000 years of peace and the second coming of Christ and the end of the world. In other words, this war was designed to bring about the book of Revelation. And that's because Woodrow Wilson believed that he was the chosen instrument of God and the person to usher in that 1,000 years of peace. So, our next question must be, how did the United States mobilize for war, and what short and long-term effects did mobilization have on American society? It's a difficult question, but it's got the same answer. It's complicated. So when people talk about mobilization, they usually mean getting the military prepared for battle. And that certainly happened in the United States, which had been a pretty small and weak military before the war. But in just 18 months, the United States went from a total military of just 200,000 to an excess of 4 million. That, my friends, is mobilization. But mobilization also involves ensuring that the home front is doing all that it can to support the war. And sometimes this took the form of war bonds, which helped raise money to support the war effort, and sometimes it took the form of controlling the factories themselves, which is exactly what happened with the War Industries Board. It was a government-run board that dictated the levels of production in every critical industry so that each factory was churning out products as quickly and efficiently as possible: guns, uniforms, shoes, bullets, everything. Now, if you looked for hand sanitizer in a store back when the pandemic started, you can probably remember what can happen to prices during an emergency. The War Industries Board not only set levels of production, it also set maximum prices that businesses could charge for products. And this was to protect against something called price gouging. So last March, when people were scrambling over themselves to buy rolls of toilet paper and paying $10 or $15 for a little squirt of hand sanitizer, that's price gouging. And so the War Industries Board wanted to protect against that, and it also set rules for unions, just in case workers tried to use the war as a pretext for, going on strike and demanding higher wages. So here, the federal government was establishing itself as a referee between management and labor to ensure that factories never stopped producing, so that we could make sure that we would win this war. Now, mobilization also meant curtailing the civil liberties of citizens or civilians for the greater good. Now, this is a controversial issue, but it's not exactly a new one. Presidents have often used war as a justification for stifling dissent. Remember the Alien and Sedition Acts? Remember how President Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War? Well, Woodrow Wilson was no different, and the Espionage Act of 1917 was designed to silence any dissent or anything that might hamper the war effort. So when Charles Schenck distributed leaflets encouraging Americans to reject enlisting in the draft, he was arrested for violating the Espionage Act. The case went to the Supreme Court. And as you know, all cases in front of the Supreme Court seek to answer one important question. And in this situation, the court was asked, are First Amendment freedoms still protected in a time of war? And in a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court said in answer to that question, yes, but not absolutely, and not in this case. So distributing materials against the draft could hurt the government's efforts to raise and support an army, hurting the war effort. And so Schenck was not free to engage in speech if the logical result of that speech was unlawful or destructive to the United States. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes explained that a person's liberties did not extend to, quote, falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater, end quote. And Schenck v. U.S. established a test for the limits of a person's freedoms, especially during wartime. And so the question is, does the action represent a clear and present danger to the safety and security of the United States? If not, then it's okay. But if it does represent a clear and present danger, a danger that is both clear and present to the safety and security of the United States, then it is not okay. And so in this case, Schenck paid the price. Okay, well, lastly, mobilization meant winning the so-called hearts and minds of the American people. In other words, propaganda. This was the work of the Committee on Public Information, sometimes called the Creel Committee because it was run by a man named George Creel. The committee worked to encourage people to support the war, both financially and emotionally. It produced posters like these, which were designed to scare. Notice how the Germans have been turned into animals, perhaps with green eyes, perhaps looking like some subhuman animal reduced to an ethnic slur like Hun, as in Attila the Hun, a savage who had marauded Europe centuries earlier. Notice also the portrayal of women in posters like these. The girl playing dress up who wishes she could be a man so she could join the Navy and fight in the war. Or the sleeping and swooning woman playing the role of Honor, half dressed and weirdly draped across Uncle Sam. Men, the honor of the nation is in your hands, these posters would say. Do your duty. Enlist. And my favorite story about the CPI is the silent film that they made about an English nurse named Edith Cavell. She had been tending to the wounded and working to protect non-combatants in Belgium, which was a neutral nation, when she was captured by the Germans. And thinking her a spy, the Germans executed her. And it's a shocking story, or at least it was when the CPI finished filming a movie called Edith Cavell, the Woman the Germans Shot. And so to the CPI, this story, whether it's true or not, or how true it is, perfectly depicted The wickedness and savagery of those evil Germans. People who would murder a nurse, a woman, a non-combatant. No wonder Americans were starting to remove German words from their vocabularies. Frankfurters became hot dogs, and hamburgers became Salisbury steak, and sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage. And even the German measles were rebranded as, you guessed it, Liberty measles. And now, all of these different types of mobilization had an effect on American society, surely, but it was the troops that were sent to the trenches in northern France that made the greatest difference. With this new infusion of soldiers, the Allies were able to begin pushing the Germans back from here all the way to here, which doesn't look like very far, and it's not. But it was enough because by late 1918, the Germans were entirely depleted, and they finally asked for peace. But note where the Germans are at the end of the war. They're still in France, in enemy territory, and yet history remembers the Allies as the victors and the Germans as the losers. Why? Because we won the treaty. Now, before we talk about the Treaty of Versailles, let's consider just how many people died in this war. Upwards of 20 million, more than had died in any war ever. And the more deaths that a country suffered at the hands of the Central Powers, the less forgiving they were likely to be. Now, looking at this chart, perhaps it makes sense that the French and the British and the Italians, who lost more than 3.5 million people between them, were in a mood to punish Germany, certainly more than the United States, which lost a comparatively tiny 117,000. Now, at the beginning of the negotiations, 27 different nations sent delegates to Versailles. But in the end, it was these big four who made most of the important decisions. Three prime ministers, Orlando from Italy, George from Great Britain, and Clemenceau from France, and a tall, awkward American named Woodrow Wilson. Now, normally treaties are negotiated by the Secretary of State, not the president himself, but Wilson decided to go to France and handle the negotiations all by himself because, well, you want to guess why? Because he saw himself as the chosen instrument of God. Moses didn't send his second in command, and neither did Jesus, and so why should Woodrow Wilson? So, who wanted what? Well, Woodrow Wilson, as you might remember, wanted to usher in the 1,000 Years of Peace, so he wanted a treaty to create a new world order whereby countries would practice war no more. The Europeans, however, wanted something very different. They wanted to make Germany suffer. They wanted to make it pay. That's why they insisted that Germany get 100% of the blame for the war and, therefore, be forced to pay reparations to the victorious nations. Now, Woodrow Wilson thought that this was an absolutely terrible idea. He claimed that by blaming Germany for a war that many nations caused, and then by charging it billions of dollars in reparations, the result would be one, German resentment that could lead to revolution, and two, an economic sinkhole in the middle of Europe that could drag down the rest of the world into a Great Depression, because economic and political stability are linked in Europe every bit as much as in the United States. Now, Woodrow Wilson might have been an arrogant know-it-all, and of course he was, but in this case he proved to be strangely accurate as a fortune teller. German resentment could lead to a revolution, and an economic sinkhole in Europe could drag the world down into a Great Depression. I feel like I see that coming. When Woodrow Wilson came to Versailles, he was armed with the 14 points. It was his plan to end all war forever. It was predicated on the notion of freedom of the seas, so that everyone could trade equally, but also self-determination, so that every nationality would have a homeland of their own. And lastly, a League of Nations, a sort of world government that would settle all international disputes peacefully through diplomacy without resorting to war. Now, French Prime Minister Clemenceau was unimpressed. He said, "Wilson bores me with his 14 points. Even God only had 10." But Wilson wanted his League of Nations, and he was willing to accept European positions on things like war blame and reparations if it meant he got his precious League. And the Europeans wanted their war blame and reparations, even if it meant giving Wilson his precious League. And that, my friends, is how the Treaty of Versailles was negotiated. Notice that the Germans had no role in the negotiation of the treaty that determined their fate. German negotiators were forced to wait outside of the room, and they were only called in when the treaty was complete. And then they had two options: sign the treaty or resume fighting a war that they were on the brink of losing altogether. And so, begrudgingly, they agreed. So to look at the map of Europe after the war, we can see a lot of significant changes. Germany lost territory, of course, including Alsace and Lorraine on the border of France. Austria-Hungary became two separate countries, and new countries emerged so that, in Wilson's idea, each nationality might have a homeland of its own. Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia were created, as was Czechoslovakia, not to mention my ancestral homeland of Poland. And curiously, the Slavic territories, which had been the cause of the war in the first place, were combined into the very pan-Slavic state that Serbia and the Black Hand had envisioned. And this sent a dangerous message, of course. Assassination works, it pays. But now that each nationality had its own territory, there never needs to be any war in Europe ever again. And there hasn't been. Asterisk, except for, that one. But let's think back to the blame pie we talked about at the beginning of the first presentation, right? You probably knew, as Wilson knew, that blaming one country was both indefensible and it sowed the seeds of future political and economic ruin. But they did it anyway. And Wilson let them because it meant he got his League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations, as Wilson envisioned it, would be a place where nations could settle disputes with words rather than bullets. TR would have hated it. Now that each nationality had its own homeland, the League would work to protect the territorial integrity of every country against threats. And because, according to Article 10 of the League Charter, all the member nations would agree to come to the aid of a country that had been attacked, this would serve as a deterrent to any nation that wanted to, invade another country. It's one thing to attack Luxembourg, but if 27 other nations are going to band together to stop me, I'm going to probably leave Luxembourg alone. And so the League Charter also answered another tricky question. Did member nations still have sovereignty, or were they forced to abide by the higher authority of this world government? And the Charter explained that nations were morally, but not legally, bound to abide by League rulings. And that's an important distinction: morally, but not legally. Woodrow Wilson returned to the United States fully believing that he had done God's will in ending the war and all war forever. So he figured that getting the treaty ratified would be pretty simple. In a word, he was wrong. When the treaty was submitted to the United States Senate, three different factions quickly emerged, each representing about a third of the United States Senate. There were the Wilsonians, who were going to do whatever Wilson wanted, so they would vote yes no matter what. Then there were the reservationists, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, who wanted to ratify the treaty. They wanted to end the war, but they were worried about this League of Nations thing and that it might take away the United States' sovereignty. And then there were the irreconcilables, led by Senator William Borah, who would rather keep fighting the war than accept a treaty that had any League of Nations in it. Now, each of these quotations, I think, is meaningful, because Woodrow Wilson said the Senate must take its medicine, suggesting that he is the doctor and he knows best, and the senators, well, they're little children, and they have to do what he says. Are you starting to see why people can't stand Woodrow Wilson? But Henry Cabot Lodge worried, as I said, about the sovereignty question. And then he said, I have always loved only one flag, and I cannot share that devotion with a mongrel banner created for a league. Well, he wanted amendments added that would allow the United States to basically ignore anything that the league said, effectively eliminating Article 10. And then there's William Borah, who hated the whole idea of the League of Nations. And when he was asked if there was any situation in which he could vote yes, he replied, if Jesus Christ came down from heaven and said he favored the League, I'd still vote no. Now, at this point, one has to wonder if the Senate is really going to take its medicine, or maybe it's beginning to resemble the Colombian Senate, with whom negotiating was like nailing jelly to the wall. Well, the treaty was voted upon 3 different times, but they were never able to get to the 2/3 margin necessary to ratify. The first attempt, Senator Lodge offered to support the treaty with the so-called Lodge reservations added. And these Lodge reservations allowed, as I mentioned before, the United States to ignore League rulings if they didn't agree with them. Now, in the vote, the reservationists said yes. The Wilsonians voted no because they didn't like the idea of those reservations. And of course, the irreconcilables voted no. And so it failed. And so then the treaty was offered without Lodge's reservations. And now the reservations who had voted yes switched their votes to no. The Wilsonians who had voted no switched their votes to yes. And of course, the irreconcilables voted no. Now, at this point, Woodrow Wilson went on a speaking tour around the country trying to convince voters to put pressure on their senators. But all of that came to a screeching halt when he suffered a stroke. Now, the president was largely debilitated by this stroke, and he rarely spoke in public after this. And finally, the Senate tried one last time, adding the reservations back in. And this time they got a few of the Wilsonians to vote, but not enough to get to the 2/3. So again, the reservationists voted yes. Some of the Wilsonians or Democrats voted yes, but of course all of the irreconcilables voted no. And so the Treaty of Versailles, after these 3 votes, Woodrow Wilson's crowning achievement, it was never ratified. Congress simply passed a joint resolution ending the war with no treaty. But no treaty also meant no League of Nations, or at least no League of Nations for the United States. So in this battle, you could say the irreconcilables won. Now, one last thought before we draw things to a close. You remember how the Bolsheviks sought to consolidate power by making a separate peace treaty with the Germans? That's what brought them out of the war and turned the 2-front war into a 1-front war between Germany and the countries on the Western Front. Well, the Allies, of course, remembered this because of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. German soldiers from the Eastern Front had been shipped over to the Western Front to kill Americans and British and French soldiers. And the resentment about this action by Russia led to one of the least remembered, but I think one of the most significant events of the 20th century. At the close of the war, most Allied troops went home, but some of them got sent to Russia in an effort to help the so-called White Russians in their battle for power with the Bolshevik Red Russians. That's right. With their allies, American soldiers invaded Russia to try to keep the Bolsheviks from winning. Well, it didn't work. The White Russians were defeated. The Allied troops went home, with the United States suffering 275 deaths in Russia. And the Bolsheviks were able to consolidate their power and create the Soviet Union. And when they did, they had some pretty well-justified suspicions about the West, including Britain and France and the United States. Now, these suspicions would only grow over future generations, and that might explain why the Soviets made a deal with the Nazis at the outset of World War II, and it might explain the rising tensions that eventually led to the Cold War. And even today, when President Putin needs to consolidate or solidify his support in his country, he can simply claim that the West is out to destroy Russia, and he has a century of mistrust on which to draw. So if the Bolsheviks were suspicious of the United States, Americans were no less concerned about the communist influence here in America. Immediately following the war, a new panic spread throughout the country, the Red Scare. It had several causes, the most obvious being the military failure in Russia. But there were also rising fears about unions, who of course represented the same laborers who had just overthrown the Russian government. Remember, the hammer and sickle was a symbol of work and labor. And add to this the continuing xenophobia that Americans felt about the latest wave of immigrants, including those coming from Eastern Europe and bringing with them dangerous ideas. And lastly, there was a growing hostility toward those members of immigrant communities who might have still clung to their ethnic heritage. These are so-called hyphenated Americans. That was a term that TR used to describe them. And these hyphenated Americans could never be fully American because they still thought of themselves as Italian American or Polish American. And to many, it seemed that the country was being overrun by foreigners with foreign beliefs, and it needed to stop. Enter Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, who instituted a series of raids designed to infiltrate and undermine these dangerous elements that were living amongst us. These included communist groups and anarchist groups and immigrant aid communities and organizations, such as the Polish Community Center in Yonkers, New York, where my grandmother worked for several years. Now, when these raids turned up that there was no master plot, Palmer justified his actions by claiming that the communists were planning a massive riot and a rebellion on May Day in 1920. And then May Day came and went with no riot and no rebellion. And pretty soon, the Red Scare died down, which is why we've never had any conflicts with communist nations ever again. Asterisk. And so this might seem a strange place to stop at this particular point, but it is appropriate because, debilitated by his stroke, Woodrow Wilson more or less retreated from public life, and a new president was elected in a year that ended in a zero, Warren G. Harding. And his story, and the story of the 1920s, well, that's the next chapter that we are going to be studying. So stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, thank you for joining us on this edition of AP United States History and You. See you next time.